Hello, welcome to PressTV's Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. One more Western country is joining the ranks of others suffering from inflation, strikes, and a growing food crisis. This time, it's Canada. The country has blindly followed the United States' lead on foreign policy. Whether it is the Ukraine-Russia war and giving money and equipment to Kiev, or sanctioning Moscow, Ottawa has mirrored Washington's policies and is now paying the price. Food and housing prices have soared and now having a ricocheting effect on various aspects of Canadian life, with many people working full-time jobs who are not able to feed themselves and some who can't afford to house themselves. Why, in one of the most developed countries in the world, are Canadians feeling more and more pressure? Well, stay with us as we take a look at this on the Spotlight. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. Out of Montreal, Yves Engler, author and a political activist. Also out of Montreal, Matthew Ehret, Senior Fellow, American University in Moscow, and founder, Canadian Patriot Review. Thank you both for being with me. Well, let's start this off with Yves. Why, in your perspective, has Canada followed the U.S. path in many of the foreign policy matters, and how do you think that this has affected Canada overall?
Well, Canada has been close to the two major empires of the past 200 years, very close to the British Empire. After World War II, became very aligned with the U.S. empire, and it sees the world and profits from the world in a very similar way, the Canadian elite to the U.S. elite. So the reasons for that are everything from the different relations between Canadian capitalists and American capitalists, to linguistic, to racial, to being European settler colonies. And that obviously continues today with regards to its policy towards the NATO proxy war, with regards to policy towards China, sanctioning Iran, being very pro-Israel, trying to overthrow Venezuela's government. Now, how has that been? That is a complicated question in terms of its impact on Canada. I mean, I think the Canadian elite have done well by that relationship. The U.S. has been the dominant global power, and the Canadian elite have made lots of profits. Canadian mining companies are biggest players in the world and have benefited from opening up countries' resources to foreign extraction. Right now, whether the conflict in Ukraine, if that is having a spillover effect on some cost of living questions in terms of inflation for the average Canadians, I think there's probably a certain degree of truth to that. But I think that in global, Canada, the Canadian elite specifically, the Canadian capitalists have done pretty well by aligning with the U.S. empire. Mm-hmm. Not that that makes it right, because it's very immoral what they do, but I don't think it's necessarily been bad for them.
Well, Matthew, what about that? I mean, Yves talked about the Canadian elite. Has the average Canadian benefited from this relationship, or do you feel that they are losing from this close relationship that Ottawa has with Washington?
Well, I think that overall your typical Canadian has not benefited in any way by the policies of being part of this Anglo-American global rules-based order for the past many, many decades. Neither have your typical average American, who are not expected to benefit from the effects of what became known increasingly as globalization, the era of stripping nations internationally of their rights to have access to utilizing the right to have protectionism, the state control of their banking systems. All of these things were banned under the age of deregulation, mergers and acquisitions that really destroyed many of the small and medium enterprises that were the lifeblood of the Canadian and American economies down south, which gave vitality and I would think a moral sort of fiber to anything that would have been viable in the previous industrial capitalist age that is long past. And I think both Yves and I were born after that age was let go of, and we embraced this new ethic of unipolarism, imposing the will of the stronger onto the weaker in a more robust way than we had ever seen before. And no, Canada has not benefited. Our infrastructure is collapsing. The average Canadian has seen opportunities diminish as we've seen the increased rates of suicide, drug use, and other things, just like we have with those same statistics in the United States, increase along the way. So yeah, it's the average Canadian has not benefited, no.
Well, I want to get more into the the food crisis that we're looking at a lot on this program. Yves, the Daily Bread Food Bank, which is largest in Canada, says the situation is critical now more than ever before, that their food bank clients have just doubled, at least doubled in size, and now that after paying for their rent and utilities on average are left with $8 a day per person to spend for food and the rest of the necessities. What does this exactly mean in Canada? Break it down for the majority of viewers who do not live there. Someone trying to live off of $8 a day after, of course, paying their rent.
Well, it would be very difficult to live on $8 a day. That's no doubt. The food costs have gone up quite starkly over the past year and a half, which is very different than most of my lifetime, or certainly my more politically knowledgeable lifetime, where prices were pretty stable. And over the past year and a half, costs in general, but specifically food costs, have gone up. I think that the biggest affordability question for most Canadians is the price of housing. The price of housing is just absolutely stunning how expensive it is to live, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver, but also now increasingly in Montreal and a number of other big cities where basically half the country lives, the greater Toronto area. The cost of housing has just exploded over the past 20 plus years, and so I'd say that's the thing that's just absolutely there. People who make even good money, making $100,000 a year, aren't able to buy a house, and it's rent for average rents are like $3,000 a month. So that's really stark. Now at the lower end, at the end of people who are, you can see it very clearly. Where I live in central Montreal, the homeless, the people unhoused who don't have houses, it was significant before the pandemic, and it's just gotten substantially worse, to the point where actually lots of businesses in this part of the downtown core are actually kind of shutting down, because the tension in the neighborhood with people who don't have housing and often have mental health issues has gotten really stark. And so the food costs has just sort of been put on top of this incredible increase in cost of housing. And as you mentioned, food bank, people going to food banks has increased. There's all these stories about how the school programs that have like food programs at school, because the cost of food has gone up so much, they can't buy as much food as they were buying before, so they don't even have they only have 2/3 of the ability to give kids who don't have proper lunch an extra snack or an extra something. So it's trickling all across. And the main point that has to be seen within is amidst obscene wealth, right? The divide between the wealthiest and the majority is just getting bigger and bigger each year. And it takes like one day of earnings for the average CEO of the major corporations to make as much as an average worker makes over the whole year. At the upper echelon in the billionaire class in this country, it just keeps going up and up and up, while more and more people are going to food banks, so that the wealth inequality is as my colleague was mentioning, part corporate globalization movement was about, so-called neoliberalism or deindustrialization. What it was really about was giving the corporations and the wealthiest more and more power to set up shop wherever they could get, cheapest labor, least environmental standards, and so they could gain even more and more of the profits. And we're really seeing that in a kind of concrete way manifest with unhoused people who need food banks, while we have more and more billionaires.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. And listening to both of you talk, of course, I'm living in Iran right now, and we know as far as the rate of inflation is high and prices fluctuate a lot. A lot of it because of the sanctions. But we're talking about Canada, which is one of the most developed countries in the world, not under any sanctions. I mean, Matthew, what's the bottom line? What's the bottom line for the reasons that housing prices are shooting up, food prices, things are just getting out of control? As Yves had said, that before these prices were pretty much stable, but now it's just constantly changing and increasing. What's going on?
Well, I tend to look at it through the prism of the old adage that whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. And I think that there's a little bit of a mix of either criminal incompetence and maybe some criminal intent, both mixed in. I'll let the audience think about what elements might be more and less in this mix. But it's a real devil's brew. Of course, when you have things as we see right now with irrationally high interest rates that make lending very difficult for most people who are already under a crunch, having suffered under years of an economic lockdown, and businesses have severely suffered. The consumer bankruptcies have increased 33% over last year. As you pointed out, food bank use has increased. The native community, especially the Inuits, are disproportionately hit by a lot of this stuff. I mean, in the case of Nunavut, there's an 8-time increase of food insecurity amongst the population up there, with the associated drug, as I pointed out, suicide and other things that have increased in direct proportion. And, so you have food price inflation, 9% on average right now in Canada. Home prices are still making home purchases unattainable, and homelessness is increasing. Meanwhile, joblessness is hiding behind fake statistics where they consider people, they say we have a 5.6% unemployment rate, which they say somehow is good, which it's not. But the reality is it's probably something like 8 times higher, because the way that they've been manipulating statistics has been to treat people who maybe work 1 day a week as if they were employed, or if they're simply looking for work but they're not working, they're treated as if they were employed. So the reality is much darker, and I think that the creation of scarcity, with the amount of abundance Canada has as a so-called first world country, there's no reason to have this level of mismanagement of our population, of our administration, which is making life harder for farmers who are being shut down. There's an attack on farmers who are average age is 61 years of age on average. We will have most of our farmers retired within 10 years. And their access to fertilizers is decreasing vastly by our sanctioning against Russia. 35% increased prices is what Canadian farmers pay for their fertilizers coming from Russia due to sanctions, which is making it impossible to produce the bounty of food that they normally would. Meanwhile, bug production facilities, the world's largest cricket production facilities, are being brought online with no limits in Toronto in the most recent case. So I think that there's an element of intention to create scarcity, unfortunately.
Well, Yves, on the one hand, we're talking about the scarcity of various things and the pressure on the Canadian people. At the same time, in the last year, Canada spent $1 billion, at least $1 billion, in military aid for Ukraine since the war. I mean, is it that the powers that be are prioritizing other people over the Canadians, or how do you assess this? Because if your own people are hungry, or if your own people are homeless, that would seem that would be the first priority.
Yeah, it's much more than $1 billion. Le Devoir newspaper in Montreal did an assessment and said this was 2 months ago. It was already at $2.26 billion in weapons that Canada had sent. The total package is over $8 billion to Ukraine. I don't personally, if it wasn't a NATO proxy war, if it wasn't a conflict that we helped provoke, I don't think that it's necessarily wrong to provide significant financial support to an international cause that was actually righteous. Unfortunately, it's not. I mean, I think Ukrainians are in a terrible situation, and I think that NATO has largely provoked this war, Canada being right at the center of that process. So this is really it was an avoidable war. But the resource allocation internationally, I think, is very, very much wrong. But I think that just the resource allocation to Ukraine is just one example. The amount of money we spend on the military, and the Canadian military is completely structured. It's not structured to defend Canada. It's completely structured to advance the U.S. empire, just like entirely, right? And so there is no genuine threat. There's only one country that could invade Canada, and that's the U.S. And the Canadian military, as I've written about and joked about, if the U.S. military was to invade Canada, the Canadian military would be helping that invasion, because anywhere the U.S. military invades, whether Canada officially participates or not, Canada is helping via NORAD, via a whole series of different arrangements between the Canadian and American military. So the allocation of resources to the military, just in general in Canada, is something that's, I think, takes resources away from building social housing. We have this huge problem with social housing. Let's put the resources into social housing versus into the military. But you go further on, and recently they just announced $13 billion, big huge subsidy to Volkswagen to build electric vehicles and batteries for electric vehicles in southern Ontario. Huge corporate welfare. Again, this would go way better used to build public housing, co-op housing, turn all this public land we have that we currently devote to highways and roadway, and turn it into places for people to live at not excessively expensive costs. So yeah, Canadian foreign policy. I mean, the Canadian people running in Ottawa, they're not looking out for average Canadians. They're looking out for their power, and part of their power is to be part of the U.S. empire, is to be part of the U.S. military-industrial complex. So obviously, devoting $8 billion plus to Ukraine, if it fits with the objectives of the U.S. empire, that's obviously going to be prioritized over those who don't have housing in downtown Montreal.
Prioritizing something else other than the people themselves. Well, Matthew, currently in Canada, there's a strike by public sector workers who say they can no longer afford to work at the current rates. Now, the government hasn't given in to their demands yet, but has agreed to a bit of a pay rise over 3 years, but strikers have not accepted it. Why are we seeing more and more people take to the streets, not just in Canada, but through many of these Western countries at this time? It seems that the pressure on the average person is reaching more and more of a peak. How do you assess this? What's the reason for this?
Well, from my assessment, I think it's the consequence of a system of internal contradictions that has been permitted to simply grow and build up those internal contradictions to a point of internal cannibalization of the system itself. You could only manage to maintain a society premised around the idea of consumerism, where the only way to have consumerism function is if you have at least equal, but ideally more production to justify the existence of the necessary aspects of a consumer society. You need to have both production, creation, and consumption, and not just one or the other. And unfortunately, over the past 50 plus years, we've created a society of global dependencies where nations are allowed to either be cheap labor, resource extraction, or sweatshop producing zones, which remain too poor to purchase the goods that are either under their soil or being produced by their factories, or they're supposed to be first world countries that are filled with useless services society jobs that no longer produce or have manufacturing, and thus do not have economic sovereignty and are dependent upon the increasing rates of cheaper and cheaper and cheaper labor abroad to satisfy those increased rates of consumption. Now, that was never sustainable, and the idea that the entire monetization of the Western system is premised entirely upon increased rates of unpayable debts, both consumer as well as national debts that are securitized, speculated upon, and turned into fictitious capital on the derivative markets that have just created bubbles upon bubbles, which are all ripe to explode, which is happening right now as we see the banking collapse enter a new phase of its meltdown in the U.S., but the Canadian Big Five banks are completely implicated in this mess. So I think, you have a society that has been wired to think of value as being principally based upon speculation and extraction rather than creation. And when you have the amount of, federal employees that can't survive with the new type of interest rates and other things that they're being told they have to live in, whether it's in France or here or across other Western nations, they will protest, they will strike and use their rights. But at the same time, there is no value in Canada's case. You have the Canada Green Commission, which sees 65% of the employees that are going on strike, as well as the federal revenue agencies. Now, this is going to be disruptive to the physical basis of our economy to do grain exports, which is a vital component of sustaining the Canadian economy. And people are just looking at the numbers. They're not looking at the real values of what's really behind the numbers. And so they're allowing for this to occur and proceed without an awareness, it seems, of the destruction to our own people and to the people of the world, which will be vastly hurt by the lack of available food that is so needed to provide to the hungry mouths across the world who have suffered so much under globalization. So again, it's internal contradictions building themselves up and exploding in our face. My short answer.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I would really love to continue this discussion, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I thank you both coming from Montreal. Yves Engler, author and political activist, and Matthew Ehret, senior fellow, American University in Moscow, and founder, Canadian Patriot Review. And viewers, as always, we appreciate you being with us on Another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye for now.